And hello to you, and welcome to the Richard Nicholls podcast, the personal development podcast series that's here to help inspire, educate, and motivate you to be the best you can be. I'm psychotherapist Richard Nicholls, and today's is a bonus episode. It's an interview with Robin Ince. And if you're ready, we'll start the show. Hiya folks, it's bonus episode time. This episode is with the very wonderful Robin Ince. Robin is a comedian, a writer, and is probably most well known for co-presenting The Infinite Monkey Cage on BBC Radio 4. He's a really interesting guy, and I think you'll properly enjoy what we have to say, so I shall press play and disappear for a bit. Enjoy. Hello, Robin Ince.
Hello.
How the devil are you doing today?
I'm all right. Yeah, it's a strange thing, isn't it? Which is what I'm really beginning to notice at this time. It's harder to track the passing of time, and I think a lot of people are now 6 months in, especially people who maybe have got kind of jobs where things were very specifically laid out and are no longer there. You do go, what happened this week? What happened last week? I know I did things. I know I was busy. I know I created things. But previously when I created things, I also got on a train and I went somewhere and I stood somewhere. And sometimes I saw real people and sometimes I heard their reaction. So, yeah, so that's where I am. I'm now in approaching a kind of Einsteinian limbo.
Wow, an Einsteinian limbo. I like that terminology where time seems to only pass outside of you, around you. And you're just an observer, wondering what the hell is going on, having an existential crisis. I'm not worried as such. I try to practice what I preach. I'm an optimist, but I'm a realist. And this year, which is only a 45th of my life, literally just my birthday, and so. A 45th of my life is just a blink of an eye, really, compared to some. But a year to somebody else who's much younger is going to seem like such a long time. Do you remember when all this first kicked off? We referred to it as the new normal. We didn't want this new way of acting to be normal, though, and a lot of people pushed against it, and still do, a year in, as we almost are now. But for some people, especially those younger ones, this way of living has become normal. It has become normal to put on a mask before you walk into a building. And I wonder if moving forward, even after the vaccinations and COVID is under control, whether we're going to retain some element of that, maybe. And maybe anyone in the next generation who notices that they're getting a sniffle or something and thinks they might be getting a cold, they'll pop a mask on. They'll sanitize their hands, they'll keep their distance from people, and it's not going to be unusual to see somebody wearing a mask. You toured last year before everything fell apart, and I know that in the summer you were in Singapore and Hong Kong, so you'll know this, but for listeners who have never visited there, you might not realise it, but because of their attitude to disease control, it's expected that you would do that sort of thing anyway, and has been for years, because they've had a history of problems with viruses, and so they know how to act accordingly. And maybe their culture is a bit more... Is socialist the right word? No. Well, yeah, cooperative is probably a better word for it. It seems hard, though, to imagine the UK is ever going to adopt quite that sort of cooperative attitude so readily, or England, at least. I probably shouldn't tarnish the rest of the UK with England's sometimes selfish attitude. Do you think we could all embrace masks?
My only issue with masks is I found out yesterday is it's very difficult for me to do book browsing, which is one of my favourite things. I have my life at the moment, having gone from last year, I don't know how many countries I played and how many miles that I travelled, but this year generally I live in my loft and then I go to the dentist about once a month. So my excitement, my big trip is, and I was browsing in a bookshop and my glasses keep steaming up. So that's my only issue with masks, is it has affected some of the browsing. There's a certain kind of level of shelf as well where I notice the breath gets caught behind the glasses. But I mean, this in terms of, we've had this kind of thing from, Boris Johnson saying that one of the reasons, that because we're free spirits and we're all of these things, and all this normal kind of malarkey thrown up with our attitude to masks. And it's as you said, it's a very interesting thing when you think of places like Hong Kong and Singapore, where it's just because we pretend that the reason we're not wearing masks is because if people are doing that, is because of a sense of free-spirited nature and rebellious nature, when in fact, I think it's a fear of looking like a bit of a dick. So I think what drives so much of English culture, I think, is a fear of showing yourself up, is a fear of shame. I think masks are one of those interesting things which to me have partly highlighted that we have. I might be wrong about this, and you'll know more than me, but I think some cultures there's a far greater duality in who you present yourself to be and what is going on in the inside. And you, as a therapist, will know that this I think is one of the battles that many people have when if they do have therapy or they think about therapy, is they realise there is a vast contradiction between who they feel they are inside and who they feel they are outside. And I know that's a very winded way of dealing with masks, but I think that kind of plays partly into the narrative of what's going on.
It does. It really does. We use this phrase sometimes in psychotherapy called the looking glass self, which is a concept created by sociologist Charles Horton Cooley, I think was his name, back in early 1900s. He thought that rather than a person's sense of self growing out of their internal perceptions, it actually grows out of the interactions with and the perceptions of other people. And he summed it up with a phrase that I really like. What he said was, and I use this all the time because I sort of fit in with this a little bit myself, not just my clients, but we're all guilty of this, I think. And what he said was, I am not what I think I am, and I am not what you think I am. I am what I think that you think I am. And it's not a healthy place to create our sense of self out there, because we can't actually control other people's thoughts, not really. Although when somebody goes to study politics at university, it's suggested that they study psychology as well. A friend of mine wanted to study politics, I think, at Oxford. Sharon, is that right? I'm not quite sure. I'll let you email in. And she was told, well, if you're going to be studying politics, you'll need to study psychology too. And she saw it through more cynical eyes and said, what, you want to teach me how to manipulate people? And she turned them down. And although there's probably some truth in learning about how others tick so as to be persuasive as a politician, but I think politicians actually should learn about cognitive biases. If they're going to be running a country, then they need to know these things. I think if our policymakers can understand the tricks our mind plays on us, it's going to be easier for them to make decisions. If we understand a bit more about the sunk cost fallacy, then we're obviously less likely to be ploughing money into something that doesn't work just because we've spent time and money on it in the past. It doesn't warrant spending more on it in the present. But our brain is stupid. Our brain will convince us that it does. And cronyism aside, this year has seen a fair bit of money being spent based on what seemed right in the past, rather than what seems like a good idea now, even if it was just a couple of months in the past. So we all fall foul of it. It's not just about financial costs. It's why people stay in jobs longer than they should, why we invest in relationships long after they should have ended, because we've invested time on them in the past. And it crops up a lot in the therapy room, it really, really does. A lot of psychotherapy is psychological education as much as therapy, it really is. Speaking of which, you've not kept it a secret that in writing your book a couple of years ago, it convinced you to go to therapy. Is that because in writing the book, the psychological education it gave you convinced you of the value to therapy, or is it because the stress of writing the book tipped you over the edge?
No, it wasn't the book that did it. It was the subject. And it was, it's one of those things that for years I'd played around with the idea of going to therapy. And then what I interviewed quite a few therapists. And as I used to, sometimes jokingly say, but in fact it was based on truth. With each therapist at the end of it, the interview would say, "I presume you're in therapy, Robin," and then I would say no, and then they would look kind of askance. And but there was a point in which, by talking to therapists and other people, I realized that I shouldn't be so ashamed of believing that something in my life was perhaps a major event. So I think that was part of it, which was there was a car accident that I was in when I was 3 years old, and in writing, it's one of those things that, this fascinating thing that the further away we move from events, the sharper they come into focus. Now, that might be because we're replaying them up in our mind and changing them each time. I don't know. It might be changing the gravity of them. But there was a point in conversation where I realised that should I give you the background? Is that okay? I don't want to bore
Absolutely,
people.
yes. Yeah. My listeners would love to hear your story. They really, really would.
When I was about just before I was 3 years old, about a couple of weeks for my third birthday, myself and one of my sisters were in the back of a small car with my mum driving, and there was a car on the wrong side of the road. It was early evening, February, and the car smashed into us, and my mum was in a coma, and spent quite a long time in hospital afterwards. And now this is the interesting bit, because I again, about being unreliable narrators of our past, I have a very vivid memory that as my sister, who'd cut her head open in the back seat, and I looked at my mum from the back seat and said, "Why is mummy's eyes closed?" So I have this kind of strong vision of it, but I'm also aware that might be true. But what I do remember very specifically about the accident was that I thought it was my fault, because, as you know, when you're a small child,
you are the world. At that age, you haven't quite developed your theory of mind, and the external world is just an extension to yourself.
You pick up your teddy bear and a vase falls over across the room, and you go, "Oh my God, I've broken the vase," whatever. And I thought, because I've been looking for the toy machine gun that was under the one of the seats, I somehow thought that because I was down there and then the crash happened, I'd caused it. And it's one of those things that, as time went on, in the last 10 years now, very much into middle age, I just kept thinking, hang on a minute, this is and when I wrote the book, I kept saying, I don't think I'll put this in. I think it's quite a boring story. And then I spoke to more people. They said, no, for someone who's, nearly about 3 years old, to believe that they've caused something that was catastrophic. And as you said also about the trunk of time, of course, my mum was in a coma for quite a while. And I think probably a month or so. And then when she came out of the coma, she came out as a younger person than she actually was. So initially we didn't exist, and she hadn't got married. She was a teenager when she came out of the coma, rather than being someone I presume she'd have been in her late 20s, early 30s then. And I just started to go, oh God, so many of my anxieties and foibles and all of those ridiculous things, a very deep fear of causing harm or hurt to anyone. I'm one of those people who far too often, are you okay? Is everything okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you happy? Are you okay? And all of those, and so I just went. I had advice from Josh Cohen, who's a lovely. I don't know if you know Josh. He wrote the How to Read Freud book in that series, and he's a
yes. He lectures at Goldsmiths.
He's a good Freudian. There's always those kind of and he recommended. He said, "Well, I think this is the person you should go and see." And I started to go and see someone, and it was, I had that moment where suddenly everything comes into focus. I'm very bad in therapy. I'm very, for someone who's overly verbose in social life. When I walk in and I get onto the couch, nothing. I know I'm not allowed to do jokes, really. I mean, she wouldn't mind jokes, but I know that that's kind of so I kind of, then I would have about 10 minutes where stuff would come out, then nothing. So it's if anyone wants to see me being silent, should I go back into therapy, I'll tell you what window you can look through to see me just lying on a couch in silence. But there was this sudden moment where I went, wow, so many of my different things about fear of public shame, fear of damaging people and all that, it did. And I know it's very crass because it will be many other things as well, but it's suddenly that acorn became, much more. And I was like, oh God, so many different things that I thought were separate issues, ideas of irritable bowel syndrome, anxiety in most public places, and all of that. And you just go, oh, these 5 things are one thing. And so it was very useful. And I only stopped, of course, because as usual, I went back to my traditional therapy, which is touring endlessly and shouting at people for 2.5 hours a night. I would have continued. In fact, had lockdown not happened, I was going to get in contact with her. And so I'd quite like to continue now.
Do. Most therapists, even those doing psychoanalysis, which it sounds like that was, they're able to work via video chat software, lots of different types. I'd recommend going back if you feel you'd like to. Don't, and this is the same for everybody, don't wait for in-person sessions to start back up, because that could be months and months, it could be 6 to 9 months away yet. And so I say that not just for you, but for the public as well. There's no need to wait. Podcasts like mine and similar ones are going to be a good start. Getting some psychological education is great, but like we so often say, it's good to talk. But hey, if you can get some education at the same time about different approaches and theories, that's great. One thing you touched upon in your book actually was attachment theory, and that's an approach I really take to the idea that we're born to attach to our caregivers. And if for some reason that care is disrupted or is absent, it has a genuinely physical developmental effect on the neurological structure of the brain. It makes us create defense mechanisms and schemas to help explain how we fit in the world, to help us control it, because an uncontrollable world is a scary one. And for you being so young, it would have been massively disruptive to lose a caregiver in that way for so long, because the disruption, not that you'd remember too much about it, I suppose, and we create all these sort of false memories and fill in the gaps anyway, but it's obvious that the disruption isn't just in missing your mum. The changes it would have created in your life would mean your dad wasn't able to be there as often. And I remember you mentioning other people coming in that really weren't the sort of Mary Poppins style carer that you might have wanted at that time, at that age. It's the extreme end of something we all experience. And I genuinely think it's impossible to not have some sort of injury to our attachments. There's not a child in the world whose parents are going to be there for 24 hours a day every time they feel that they need them, whether that's because they're in hospital or absent in other ways due to parents' problems, their issues, their addiction or depression, or simply just because they're in the shower, you know? A child will cry, and for one reason or another, they won't get attention, even if it's just because their dad is in the toilet, let alone if there are bigger things going on. And I would love this sort of sliding doors ability to be able to see into parallel universes and see the timeline of our alternative lives. And because of being able to see that, we can look at the influence of nature versus nurture. It'd be amazing to see what people's lives would be like if significant events hadn't happened, to see what your life would be like if that accident hadn't happened, or if you weren't the youngest in the house. Were you the youngest? That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. See, that's a fascinating thing as well to me, because this was an interesting thing, which is, of course, I couldn't deny the existence of the book to my family, and I was quite worried about my dad reading it. I mean, there are certain things that I didn't explore in the book because it's not only my narrative; it's other people's narrative as well. And there's a bit I feel a responsibility of what. But there was an interesting thing. My sisters, 2 older sisters, read it, and I increasingly realised that all the different ways that because one of my sisters would have been nearly 11 years old, and she wasn't in the car. She was watching Top of the Pops when the police came to the door and knocked on the door and said something had happened. And my mum was pretty much expected to die as well. And then I had my other sister who was in the car, who would have been about 8 years old. And then there's me. And now we look, and sometimes we talk, and so many of the different, we definitely went in different paths. It's like my dad was saying, my eldest sister is, she just has to do stuff all the time. Both of us actually have a thing, which is we're not good at sitting down and being quiet. I need to do that. I can go and do that. Let's try and make this now. Let's do that. And she in particular like that. And my dad said, I don't know where you get that from. And then I thought, well, perhaps because that one isn't, genetic. That one, I know obviously nature and nurture is a very blurred area and it's very interesting. But that bit of descending into perpetual busyness, I feel that may also somewhere along the line having disruption at a certain age, and for my eldest sister, of course, she had the experience of, for me, I didn't really know my mum before she went into hospital, before the accident, whereas she did. So you have the fact that someone is changed. And I think, all of these, and I find that, I mean, you talked before when you'd had James Withy on, who'd written a wonderful book about dealing with his depression, and his cousin, isn't it, Rebecca Payton?
Yes, Rebecca Payton. I saw them both on your Cosmic Shambles episode in the summer, which is why when James contacted me about his book, I was so happy to say yes. Because, hey, if he's good enough for the Cosmic Shambles Network, he's definitely good enough for me. I chatted with him for my YouTube channel. It was a really interesting conversation. And if anyone hasn't watched that, please do. It's there on my YouTube channel. And yeah, his cousin is Rebecca Payton, who, before COVID, was touring a play about her experiences.
And Rebecca, is a very old friend of mine. And seeing her, and I interviewed her for the book, she lost her dad when she was 6 years old. And then her sister was murdered when she was in her mid-30s. And she's one of those people that when I first knew her, she was an ebullient individual. She was my agent for a while. We got on very well. We had mutual friends before that happened. And it was years later that I realised, years after her sister had been murdered as well, that I came to realise that her life has been a perpetual struggle and a battle. Because when she wrote this great piece of work, I mean, I think this is something I wish I dealt with more in the book, because I realised it afterwards, which is anyone who is in any way can create something out of their trauma or a situation they're trying to work out, whatever it is. And I don't mean professionally, I mean literally in any way. If you can sit down, I was talking to a friend of mine who works in prisons, and some of the tools that they give to some of the prisoners to try and create a story, to try whatever it is. And, she created this work after her sister was murdered called Sometimes I Laugh Like My Sister. And, told me this incredible story, which is, as she walked off stage the first time she performed it, she turned to the guy she'd written it with, and she said, I've realised who was speaking on stage. And he kind of went, oh, well, I thought it was you. And she said, no, it was the 6-year-old that no one listened to when her father died. Now, that to me this is one of the great sadnesses, I think, of being human as well, which is, things can happen, as we know, some terrible things can happen to people, and the fact that it's so hard at that point of the development of the brain to grow up and not be changed by that. And then the fact that also, and this is a thing which I think is in our culture as well, that culture of shame, the fact that people think, oh, look, it just happened, I don't want to go back there, I don't want to dwell on that. People are embarrassed to return to things or to think that there's something that might have affected them, and that embarrassment and that inability sometimes to just go, do you know what, there's nothing wrong, there's something that happened to you. And sometimes it might be something quite minor, as you said. Sometimes attachment theory it might have been what we would see as a very small incident, but which to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, when those things are so big and they can be so dramatic, that did mean something. And I think that's I'm sure you in your work, that importance of saying there is no shame because we don't just move on, we don't leave things behind. So, and especially at as we're growing up, as we're developing, our brains are developing to 23, 24 years. I mean, they still develop off that, but in terms of the change in growing up, I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of being able to realise that the things that make us. It's like when someone says they're a self-made man, you go, there's no such thing as a self-made man. Your culture, your family, your experience, anyone who wishes to declare that has entirely misunderstood how brains work.
The difference between a lady and a flower girl is not how she behaves, but how she's treated. One of my favourite lines in literature from Pygmalion, and probably My Fair Lady as well, actually. Who we are is more than just our DNA. It really, really is. Anyone who's watched Trading Places or read The Prince and the Pauper or watched My Fair Lady knows this. Our experiences, both positive and negative, will influence so much. Our experiences can teach us the emotional intelligence we might need to see the difference between anxiety and excitement, between guilt and shame, so that we can wear a mask for a few months of our life and not worry about looking like a dick because our sense of self is strong enough. Not everyone's that fortunate, though, which is why so many people fear judgment from other people so much. Famously, if you look at the surveys of the top fears and phobias, a fear of dying is only number 2. But a fear of public speaking is top of the shop. Number 1, a fear of being judged by other people, of possible rejection by our peers, which a million years ago was tantamount to dying anyway, being rejected. I think it's important that we all know this so that we can be okay with stretching our comfort zones if we have to. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I love being on stage. It's terrifying. I feel sick beforehand, and I stand there behind the curtain thinking, oh, why do I do this? Why do I do this? And I'm terribly anxious, but I'm able to channel that into excitement by the end of the performance. And after walking off stage, I always say the same thing to myself. That was great. I can't wait to do it again tomorrow night. Do you find a similar thing?
We see that's an interesting change, and from a lot of conversations I've had with people about this was I think there's a very interesting. I remember talking to a brilliant author called Lisa Blower, who's fantastic, and she said, "You're so confident," and I said, "That's a very interesting thing, isn't it?" Which is, as Philippa Perry said to me, the problem with being human is we judge everyone else from the exterior and we judge ourselves from the interior. And I think that is one of the biggest problems, because I know the older I've got, the more anxiety that I feel on stage. So I love performing. It's what I've done for my whole adult life. But more and more, I stand there, and as I'm going blah 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 blah, I'm thinking, are they happy? Are they okay? Are they happy? Are they okay? Are they having a good time? I hope they're having a good time. And that worries, it becomes much greater. And I've talked to more and more people about that. Some people don't have that, and some people are just doing their shows. Some people it depends. But what someone said to me, and I think it's very true, one of the reasons a lot of performers, the best point in the day is to be stared at by people, because you know why they're staring at you. So when you go and stand on stage for 2 hours, they're looking at you, you're in control. The moment that you walk off that stage, you get onto the train, you're walking down the street, you are no longer, you've not given a frame for yourself. You are just someone who's a weirdo with old glasses, who's walking in a funny way and got a stupid coat on, or whatever it might be. So I think that's a very interesting thing, the side of that, though people have a terror of performing, that actually people who've become performers, public speakers, whatever, some of them at least, it's like that moment where you go, now I control the situation of being looked at. And for the other 22 hours a day, I don't control the situation of how I'm looked at.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I can't imagine what it must have been like for, you probably remember this, for Rob Newman and David Baddiel. They were the first comedians to do a stadium performance in the UK, because back then here, comedians just didn't do that. Not really. Not to that extent. It was unheard of. There were theatres, obviously, and festivals like Edinburgh and so on, but not to 12,000 people at a time. It's no surprise that their working relationship broke down.
Well, they were very young men as well. They were young.
God, yeah, they were still in their 20s.
So they're still developing. So, when you're in your 20s, your tastes have changed, all of those things. So, I think that's why we see that with bands quite often when they fall apart, is because they might have started working together when they were 19, and you're not. When you're 28, you're not. But yeah, that's an interesting. It's an intriguing thing, actually, the arena thing, because I've had that experience from the fact that working with Brian Cox. So I'm not the draw. Let's make that clear, that this is not some moment of crazed egotism. But Brian attracts these huge audiences, and I'm part of the show that we do. What I found really interesting was doing things like getting the chance to do the O2, which is never going to happen for my solo career, and quite right too. And but the fear is very different. It's not the same as being in a room with somewhere between 200 and 500 people, where there's a very different sense of connection. But I can also see how it can go. For me, of course, it's not going to make my ego go crazy, because I know that I'm not the draw. Whereas I can also see now when you see comedians who, I've spoken to comedians who just go, oh, I can't stand playing the O2. Well, don't play the O2. You don't have to play the O2. Why are you playing the O2? And this battle between ego and so then that brings in a totally. So when you were saying about Newman and Baddiel, I can see that brings into play a very different part of that particularly kind of male ego. Look at all these people and. Sorry, I interrupted your question.
No, I was just going to say that I often think that comedians would make very good therapists. Both seem to be interested in what it is to be human. Comedians seem to have a curiosity about them, about human nature. It's a rare thing for a comedian to tell stories that aren't about people. I mean, maybe they can make some jokes about cats and dogs and so on, but more often they're people watchers, like therapists. We're interested. One of the many things about COVID that I've missed is the ability to sit in a coffee shop and just watch people interact with each other, or not, as the case often is. To see the personalities in people being displayed through group dynamics, or just to watch a couple sit on their phone for 20 minutes and ignore each other. My wife is the same, frustratingly. I say frustratingly because she always wants to sit in the corner of a coffee shop to look out, and I end up with my back to the room, missing out on everything. Do you think that's right, though, that comedians are curious people watchers?
I think certainly the comedians that I hang around with, it is. I would say, the people like Josie Long or Sarah Pascoe or Stuart Lee or any of those people, which is they have a very deep interest in what it is to be alive, to be curious, to, some of them more politically than others, sometimes more, I'm always interested in that divide between science and art. And I think, the thing that brings it together is both of them are driven by curiosity. Those who are passionate in whether they're working as a scientist or passionate as a comedian, when it is more than a job, then it is driven by why did that happen like that? And why is that person doing that? And hang on, what does that say about the way that I do that? So it also that bit where as we watch our differences and we see our similarities, like when you see the very best observational comics, they take you, so you have that first reaction where people go, oh, you do that as well, Paul. And then you get the next stage they take you at and they go, oh, hang on a minute. Oh, God, is that the reason I'm doing it? Oh, is that what's going through my head? So the really good ones don't just stop at saying, hey, when. They then say and becomes and I think it's a really, I've been fascinated in the last 10 years, I think, as a stand-up there, and especially when I was doing things like shows that were maybe partly based around the book or about some of the other kind of things, that it's always interesting when you find out that the number of people who remain silent about the things that they're anxious about. And like you saying with the therapy thing, I was, when I gig, I would normally go to the bar afterwards. I normally say to people, you want to have a chat or whatever, I'll just be, because I think, very often I hear amazing stories afterwards and you meet people and you get to know who your audience are. And it's very interesting what people want to share and what people will tell you. When I first dealt with talking about impulsive thoughts, and I did a routine that just got longer and longer. Originally, it was like a 5-minute bit. And I remember the first time I doing it thinking, oh, my God, when I do this bit on stage about holding babies and being scared of throwing them down the stairs or throwing them over a cliff or whatever, this could be a very strange moment for the, and then it just built and it became almost the whole of a second half of a show, because every single night someone would come up to me or, oh, I've not had this, but you know what I get? I get this one. Oh, I get that one. I get this when I'm on the train station platform. I get this sometimes when I'm with an elderly relative. I got this when I was standing on a balcony. I got all of that thing. And that to me, again, is that's my deep fascination is the gap between who we seem to be and who we are, and both of them are real, of course. That's one of the things that I find, and I can't. It's like in the book that I'm working on now. I almost wish it was on a different subject as usual, because every single chapter I'm going, but it's 30,000 words over already, and I'm editing it, and every single day it's getting 2,000 words longer, which is not the way the edit is meant to be going. But each chapter, like working out different senses of what is real for people, I'm fascinated by the fact that when we're in any room, how many different realities are there? Not merely the physical, scientifically measurable reality, but I was watching a thing. You might know this guy, Lorimer Moseley. Have you come across this guy? He's a pain expert, and he's based in Australia. And
Oh, him, yes. He he used to work, I think, at Oxford and did some amazing studies with fake arms and things, getting people to feel pain in the fake arm. And he did some stuff with virtual reality goggles or something where people could make sensations in their body feel as if they're outside of themselves. Very interesting guy.
he did this lecture where he talks about the fact that the first thing you need to know about pain is that it's real. It doesn't matter that you go that, and he shows this great example, I think, from the BMJ, which is somebody came to hospital and he was a workman who a screw had gone all the way through his foot, right the way through his boot. It's like you see this work boot and there's a screw, and he was in agony. He was screaming and screaming. They had to use the highest doses of morphine that they could. He was in such agony. Eventually, they took the boot off. When they took the boot off, it turned out the screw had gone between the gap between his big toe and the toe next to it. It had not even pierced his foot.
What? That's amazing. Yet the guy is in absolute agony and needs morphine.
But the reality of the experience, and that moment of when he says, that's the first thing you have to accept. The pain is real.
Yep.
You can't, and we see this with lots of different kind of sometimes conditions where there's a debate about whether they're physical or whether they're mental. And
both.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, which and that's what I find so fascinating, is because you can then, that broadens out. It's not just about pain. It's about so many different levels of our reality and so many things I'm sure you've had to deal with sometimes talking to people where you go, the first thing is I can't just say you're making this up or it's make-believe or get over it, because it's. I was talking to someone who had sleep paralysis, and she made a great little short film about it. And when she talks about the fact that when the kind of the night hag or whatever it is that sometimes would be squatting on her chest, and she could feel the spit on her face.
Yeah.
And when she woke up, she knew it had not been physically real, but it was a very real experience, which would.
But it feels so real.
Yeah.
Our brain just can't separate fact from fiction. That's the reason why, when I first thought about becoming a therapist, I was so interested in hypnosis and hypnotherapy, because it uses so much of the imagination. It's amazing to think that when we think about doing something, our brain is firing off all the same neurons as if we're doing it for real, which is great. If we're using our imagination to our advantage, if we're imagining everything going well, but of course it has the opposite effect. If we're worried about everything going wrong or worried about making a fool of ourselves, because it trains our brain not just to expect it to happen, but also convinces it that it already has happened, and time after time after time. And I'm a little bit worried for the post-COVID times. Actually, we're all being so cautious of the outside world that it could so easily make our comfort zones get smaller and smaller and smaller from the world that was so easily and confidently accessible to just our hometown. I haven't been 10 minutes away from my front room since March, and it's probably going to be a full year before I do, maybe not even then, which is fine for me, because I'm aware of any anxiety that shrinking my comfort zone might bring, and I'm okay with feeling it when I have to start stretching it back out again, because that's my job. I know all about it. And I think anyone who isn't a therapist or doesn't have much experience in emotional regulation, they're going to find it really hard. Now that their comfort zone has shrunk, it's going to be a scary thing to get the old normal back again. It's going to be like playing the O2 Arena, something you know all about. How did that feel, Robin, making that leap from comedy festivals to big stadium events like the O2? Did that feel safe? Was that within your comfort zone?
Yeah, you know what? It's a weird thing, because the worries that I can always find it's that fascinating thing, isn't it? That the anxiety imagination will always come up with something new. So if you are someone who has a predilection to feel anxious about something, when you eventually go, do you know what? There is no way this is going to happen. This is ridiculous. And then it goes, come up with a new one. Oh, bloody hell, anxiety. It's so, but so I would have very mundane anxiety, but not the same worry that would suddenly hit 10 minutes before a show in a small theatre on my own. So it was like, So I didn't have it was weird. I mean, I would always worry. My worry in that situation is, I hope I don't let people down because they've all come to see Brian Cox and then this idiot comes on doing silly, and so I would think far too much about that. But it wasn't the actual. I think partly because I was facilitating the show. Right, I wasn't. It wasn't entirely on my shoulders. There is someone beautifully explaining the universe, and then every time that we begin to feel that the audience is going, "This is beginning to hurt," this amount of particle physics, then I come on and do something light and silly, or a poem, or whatever it might be. So it didn't have the same pressure as being in. I mean, it's interesting. Neil Innes, the brilliant, singer songwriter, Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, and the Ruttles, and all that. Someone was when he died. I can't remember who it was. It might be Michael Palin said, because you'd think, Neil Innes should have been huge. He was so brilliant. He was an amazing songwriter. He wrote one of Oasis's songs. I can't remember which one it is. There's one of his songs which basically he went, hang on a minute, that's a little bit too close to mine. And he has, I think it might be that his beautiful song, How Sweet to Be an Idiot, I think the very similar melody in Oasis, and he won that thing. But Michael Palin said he didn't want to play to more than 500 people. He did want it to be an event that it had a sense of being shared. It had a sense of you can every now and again see individual people's faces, and that. I mean, that's and that's a very beautiful thing. So yeah, it was an odd experience for the fact that. And someone also said to me, once you play to 1,000 people, it doesn't get that much different. And I think that's an interesting thing, which is when you first start gigging and you might be playing to 12 people or 20 people. Oh my God, there's 20 people in. And then the next, oh my God, there's 100. There's 100 people in, there's 100. And then there's 200, right? And each time it feels like a leap. But once you play to somewhere where it feels big, whether it's an old Victorian theatre or whether it does start to, it's not, because the different connection, I think from about...
There's a bell curve, I think, isn't there?
Yeah.
That if you plot any extra anxiety that adding people into the audience creates, the more you add, the less anxiety is added each time. Yeah. And maybe as those faces get smaller, it almost anonymizes the people in the audience. So it's almost like presenting to an invisible radio audience.
I still always had to change because like especially the first bit with Brian, where I come on and we'd have a chat, we would both always try and throw things to each other which we were not expecting. Because to keep it, because we did it. I think we did the show that we did last year. We did about 80 or 90 times, and it was and we had fun. And it's an interesting thing about. Again, perhaps it's lucky this is happening when we're older and everything like that, because we never argue either. I know very specifically where, considering I think that year we did, including the other things that we do together, we probably did 120 shows together. We went around the world. We were very close proximity. And then every now and again, there'd be a point where we'd both be a bit jet lagged, and I'd think, I'll sit in that corner of we always had a separate dressing room, but we never used a separate dressing room. We would it's all right, we'll just stay in this one, and that kind of thing. And I think that's a nice thing which can happen with age as well, which is with your ego is calmed down, and you can just go, this is fun. Let's just have fun. And let's hang on. You've got more satsumas in your bowl. Why have you got more satsumas in whatever it is that you hear about these wonderful arguments that the triangle of brie must be exactly the same size for whichever whether it's the bass player or whether it's the triangle player.
The meaning behind our experiences is always what creates the emotion. If the meaning behind somebody's fruit bowl having more satsumas in is indifference, then there's no anger or sense of neglect, no negative emotion. Like we always say, it's the thought that counts. I'm glad you brought up intrusive thoughts earlier, actually, because when I did an episode last year about crazy and intrusive thoughts, it was one that received the most feedback from people saying, wow, I didn't know everyone else had these crazy thoughts too. I thought it was just me, with stories about them sitting on the sofa next to their wife, and suddenly they have this thought about punching them in the head, and they say, I don't want to punch them in the head. I think it would be the worst thing in the world, but I can't stop thinking about doing it. Does that make me a potential abuser? Am I a horrible person? And I'm like, no, you're just human. If it's the worst thing in the world to you, then that's why it's so easy for it to become in focus in your mind. I think people, they mix up the things that they fear with the things that they desire. Sometimes they don't want to throw the baby down the stairs or chuck it off a cliff, but if the option is there, it's going to pop into your mind that you could. And again, we're back to that same old story of the brain not knowing the difference between fact and fiction. Your brain is activating neurons as if you did harm the baby. And if you focus on it, it's going to make you feel horrified and ashamed for something you haven't even done and desperately don't want to do. And I really do think that more and more people need to understand that we have a brain that does all these weird things and not judge ourselves over it and not judge others either.
But people leap. This is the problem as well, isn't it? Which is, before we started recording, I think we talked briefly about social media, and there are places with the speed of judgment. And once the judgment has been made, because it's been typed out, you can't back down. Again, that sunk cost thing as well. All of those things are going, and that's what I think is such which is why a lot of these conversations are best not to. It's a tragedy. I think that there are many different issues which are far too serious and far too complex to be dealt with on Twitter, and have been, and have turned people who previously, years before, would have been allies with differences into enemies. And I think that inability to sometimes share those, as you said, because those things, punching someone in the head or whatever, is that whole thing, which is, I used to describe it, they're like public information films. What happens in a situation is your brain says, you're sitting on a sofa with your wife, so remember, don't punch her in the head. Good night and sleep well. And of course, but as it's delivered to you, as your brain is saying this, it's delivered at such speed that you see it as an urge or a desire. And once we can open up, and I mean, one of the sad things is, I know that from what I've read, and you may be able to correct me on this, but these kind of impulsive thoughts and intrusive thoughts can lead to obsessive compulsive behavior and obsessive compulsive disorder, because they must stay secret. And I remember reading a very interesting case about, because it's the most taboo thing in society very often, which is the intrusive thought, they will very often be sexual thoughts. So I know that during the long period of time where there was paedophilia was in the news a lot, and I read about a young woman, 16 years old, and she suddenly got this thought in her head, I think about her younger brother. It just popped in and then popped out. And from that point onwards, then for the next 5 years, she just became more and more depleted, until eventually it was impossible for someone not to say there's something going on. And then she went to go and have that stranger conversation with a therapist, and it came out, and they were able to explain it. And that thing with, especially when it is, because those kind of ideas, people work. There's no way someone is going to. It's very rare someone will be comfortable enough to share something like that, and then you can have lives that are absolutely ruined based on a misunderstanding of what's going on in our minds.
I've had many people over the years say similar things to me in therapy. They're horrified over the thoughts they've had about family members and dreams as well. We have to realise that we can't control our dreams, and despite what people might claim, they are 99% meaningless, just a collection of electrical activity that our brain turns into moving pictures. Like I say to clients who come to me talking about their fears that they might be a paedophile, and I'm so honoured when someone gets to such a point in therapy where they feel safe enough with me to be able to say that, because sometimes that takes many sessions of talking about lots of other stuff before they finally get round to the real reason they're there. Like I say to them, the fact that it horrifies them is the biggest evidence they have that they would never harm anybody. Even genuine paedophiles almost never harm children. They'll probably never touch one in their life. What people tend to think of as a paedophile is something that's been created by the media, really. It's just a plain old sadist. Somebody that just wants to cause pain and control other people. And children are easier to control than adults. So that's what they do. It's been suggested that actual paedophilia is more like a sexual orientation than anything else. And just like not every heterosexual man wants to, and he's going to touch every woman he sees, I'd like to think that, they have enough control over themselves than that. The same applies to paedophiles. More studies are required, as you could imagine, because it's pretty difficult to get people to take part in these studies. And much as I would love that we could all be more honest about what goes on in our head, it's a very scary thing to think that we could normalise the idea of jumping on Twitter and saying, "Hey everybody, is it just me, or does everyone think about touching kids sometimes?"
Well, exactly, because that's exactly the wrong place to do it. That's the whole thing, isn't it? The detachment from nuance, from physical signals, from people knowing who you are. That's the thing, isn't it? Is hopefully all of us have some friends or a friend who you can have a level of trust with, that you can sometimes have those stranger conversations and I think that's why things like your podcast are really important, because that's part of it, is just putting it out there to explain that. I mean, I think it's a lovely thing that Charles Fernerhoff said, who wrote a great book about inner voices within. And he said, what you need to remember, and the way he sees it, is not all your thoughts are your thoughts. Some of it is just the noise of the machinery. It's clunking away and something comes up and then you obsess about it and then it becomes your thought and then it starts to destroy you. And I think there's so many, I mean, that's what I find very interesting in neuroscience as well, which is as we discover more and more that our decisions are very rarely a singular us making that decision. There are many different things going on in the brain. There are many different reasons. And actually, sometimes people can say, "Oh my God, I made a mistake and I feel so bad about that mistake." And we go on and on about it and we tear ourselves apart and we put on a hair shirt and it can become and actually that point of going, do you know what? A mistake happened and I was part of that mistake. I've learned from it, but I'm not as much in charge as I'd like to be. Now, some people find that scary not to be in charge, but I think that bit of just going, it doesn't give you carte blanche to do anything, because I think also if you're the kind of person who starts thinking like that, you are already wanting to take as much responsibility as possible, but realizing that some of the things that we say and some of the things that we do they're part of a much bigger landscape of all the things going on in our brain. And I think all of these different things, that once we get them out there, if we can get more and more people just knowing about whether it's intrusive thoughts, whether it's about, different forms of obsessive compulsive behavior, whether it's about the way that what may seem to them now like a minor incident, but one that still niggles and then like 80 years. I mean, you hear these incredible stories of people who are, 75, 76 years old, 80 years old, beyond that, something happened in a different time with a different culture and they were castigated for that and they've lived with guilt and shame and not talked about something, and then towards the end of their life they open up, they find someone who has given them permission to speak. Because I think it's something that I've talked about with a lot of people, and again I've realized from my position of privilege that it's something that I don't think I'd realized how important it is, which is to give someone permission, whether that's permission to pursue the job they'd really like to do, the world that they think couldn't be theirs, for whatever different reason that they feel that is not a path that is even visible to them, or whether it's about expressing themselves, whatever. That sense of here's the card that says you have permission to speak or to do.
Wonderful, yes. I certainly see it in my client work. Many times people come to me in their 70s and they open up for the first time about things that have been bothering them since they were teenagers, and they say, "I've never said any of this to anyone before." And I think, why not? It's such a shame that we have this culture where we're supposed to keep everything to ourselves. It's ridiculous. It's amazing, though, to be in the right place at the right time for someone, though. So many times in my career, somebody will come in and I'll say something like, "So, what brings you here today?" And for an hour, I just sit there and say close to nothing. I just let them talk, and you can see the relief on their face that they've finally got it all out. And they say, "Thanks for listening." They walk out, they pay the receptionist, and they don't come back. They just needed that one session, and they knew it. So, Robin, 2021 then, you've got a new book out.
Hopefully, if I keep editing it in time and I manage to get it thin enough, there should be a book out in. I think it's October. I think it was always meant to be October, but they did that normal thing, which would say we'd like to see something in September because they know full well that authors are very good at going. Look, I know I said I've been working on it, but I got very distracted. I've had some issues at home, so I delivered my 150,000 words of the 120,000 word book that I'm meant to be doing, and I've edited it down to 155,000 words now. And I'm having a huge amount of fun with it. It's like it's one of those books that's changed a lot because of lockdown, not because of psychologically lockdown, but because of the opportunities it gave me to speak to people and things like that. And it was I wanted to write when we were doing, quite often when I've done tours, in particular with Brian, people can leave with a certain level of existential kind of anxiety or shock. And I think sometimes they hear these scientific ideas that are just so large that they terrify people, and it gives them cosmological vertigo. And so that was the initial thing, was I was going to write a book where each chapter was explaining how various different ideas, which can seem enormous and terrifying, have within them some consolations as well. But it's kind of gone off now somewhere else, which is, I think the more I've written about it, the more I've realised how many different scientific ideas connect us and are connected and give us these different ways of feeling, whether it's part of a society, part of humanity, or part of the universe. So I'm just having having a lovely. I mean, I've got to speak to people like Jane Goodall, which was just brilliant, and that was. And she'd normally never be available because Jane Goodall at 85 years old is still just traveling and traveling and traveling and campaigning and campaigning and campaigning. And she's a great example of what you can be as a human being. And for the last 6 months, she's been in her old home in Bournemouth. So I have a friend who has, who sometimes looks after various different apes, and she had a friend who had an email, who had and that. So it's been. I've just had lots of really lovely conversations with people, and it's kept me sane. It's one of those things that Rose, you were saying about being optimistic, and I've realised I think I'm kind of quite pessimistic and anxious, but all the work I do drives me into a position where, for that period of time, I have to be optimistic. So I think I've actually picked like the shows that I've done in obviously not this year, the one that I would have done this year. Increasingly, they have upbeat themes because it drives me to have to place my mind in an upbeat scenario. But this one's just been. And again, the conversations about reality with people and conversations, the people with sleep. But that's the trouble, is every idea to me leads immediately to another idea. And then each chapter just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I managed to make the chapter very, very short, but I've only made that chapter short by turning it into 4 different chapters. So it's great. That chapter on education, it's only 5,000 words now. God, it was 20,000 words the other day. Well, the other 15,000 words have now become 25,000 words about reality, complexity, and the nature of the size of the universe. Oh. That's generally what's going on.
Do you have a title for it yet?
Well, I want to call it, but I know I won't be allowed to. I want to call it the Shabby Cure, the consolations of being curious. And the reason I want to call it the Shabby Cure, I don't know if you know, there's a W.H. Auden line where he said, when I'm in a room full of scientists, I feel like a shabby curate in a room full of dukes. And of course, because so much of my life is being in rooms with these incredible scientists with incredible levels of understanding, far beyond whatever I'll be able to reach. I thought that's why I am and I'm also from a background of various different. There's various priests hanging off my family tree, so I thought the Shabby Curate. But I know that they'll go. It doesn't say what it is, because of course nowadays that's what books have to. Nathan Filer's fascinating book about schizophrenia, which was originally called The Heartland. And then when it went into paperback, it was like, not enough people know what the Heartland is, what that means. So it's now called, This Book Will Change Your Mind About Mental Health. I think that's what it's called. I would highly recommend it in either form, by the way. Nathan Filer. Do you know Nathan at all?
I don't know him, but I read that book, and right from the introduction where he's talking about what it's like to be a psychiatrist needing to forcibly administer drugs, I was gripped. He tells a great story.
He wrote a great book called The Shock of the Fall, a novel about a teenage boy, his kind of the development of his mental health issues through his teenage years. And Nathan was a mental health nurse, and he also did this brilliant archive hour on Radio 4, which was about things that we believe about mental health treatment, which are not true, and myths, or not necessarily myths, but things which have. So he started with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the fact that
there's a lot of hyperbole and exaggeration.
Yeah, it's very. And he said, and he had lots of different people who've had shock therapy who say, I think she was someone who worked for Mind, I think it was, and it was like saying, no, shock therapy. It's not merely this idea it's a punishment to destroy someone. No. Shock therapy has for a large number of people, as usual in the history of psychology, there will be periods of time in the 20th century where it was misused, and that's the fascinating thing, isn't it, with the history of the mind, is it's still so new, and you still look back and you go, that was a bad way of doing a lobotomy. In fact, looking back, I don't even think lobotomy should have happened. All of those things are lessons to be learned. But yeah, he's a very, very interesting guy. But yeah, his book about the possible, the idea that schizophrenia is just this huge umbrella term for an enormous number of other things and is possibly a fiction, is a very interesting book and very well researched.
Yeah, most people they really don't fully understand it's called electroconvulsive therapy, yet it has some really good results for severe depression, and it's far more gentle than One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or that one scene do you remember this? Morons from Outer Space with Mel Smith, where he's pinned down and forced to listen to Van Halen. It's nothing like that at all. It's even done under general anaesthetic anyway nowadays. So anyone who's listening that's been offered it and has been put off by it, honestly, I've met people that have had some great benefits from ECT. I really have. So 2021 is going to be a busier year than 2020 if we're allowed to get out and start doing stuff.
Well, yeah, I've kind of, my wife in a moment of incredible optimism has bought me a 2021 diary, and I've said I'm really not entirely, because I find looking at the 2021 just too. I don't even open it. I had to open it one day, and I just look at these places I was meant to be there, and I'm really feeling that now when I see something, a documentary made in Glasgow or Belfast or whatever. I think, I've not been there this year, and I've not been there. But it might just be more writing and more. I've got an idea for another. In fact, I quite want to write a very short little book about my experience of therapy and the different ideas that it led me to. So I'm thinking of kind of doing that if I ever finish editing this other book, because I've just realised I've just got to create as much stuff from home, because I don't think it's going to be. I would have been on tour now. That tour, they said, why don't you move it to the spring? I said, do you know what? Let's just wait. And I think I was probably right to. I've got so finding replacements like we're doing. I normally do a big show with Brian at the Hammersmith Apollo, where we have lots of scientists and bands and all manner of things, and no one ever knows who's on. So we've had things like The Cure suddenly appear, and the audience go, "Oh my God, that's The Cure!" And we get these great. And so instead, I'm going to do a 24-hour show where we've got kind of Chris Hadfield and Sophie Ellis-Bextor and all manner of scientists and Helen Sharman and stuff like that. So I'm still trying to work out as many ways as possible to just be creating the whole time, because
the new normal.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's the only way. I have to descend into busyness. I have to feel that something's being created at the end, and it's a weird. I actually get a headache. I only found this out in the last couple of years. I had some days I just would get this really and then the moment that I'd sat down, and if I wrote 2,000 words that had some purpose to them, or if I made something, it would lift. That it actually feels, again, it may well be very psychosomatic, but creating something goes. I know Noel Fielding's talked about that, because Noel Fielding always goes up and does all these amazing paintings that he does, and he says he can't not. He has to. It's beyond a minor urge. It's an urge where the day will fall apart if something hasn't been created.
It's a bit like how Sir Ken Robinson would talk about it. He made this excellent TED Talk, still the most watched TED Talk of all time, all these years later, and an absolute masterclass in how to present to an audience. Amazing guy. R.I.P. Ken, another victim of 2020, and he's going to be sorely missed. He said that some people just can't think unless they're moving. And I certainly see that in myself. I was only talking to my son about this morning, actually, as I dropped him off at school, because we were joking about me having to share my workspace with my wife since March. We're both in the same room when I'm not seeing clients on my laptop in my front room. And it's been really hard on one hand, it's really nice seeing my wife a little bit more often. She's quite easy on the eye, and I love her very much. But I don't want to disrupt her when I'm busy being me, because when she wasn't around and I needed to think of some way of putting something across if I'm writing or scripting a podcast episode or something, because I make these weekly podcast episodes as well for Patreon patrons. So there's normally a lot of pacing about and talking out loud. I pretend that there's an audience and gesticulate wildly about the kitchen as I waffle on, talking to my kettle all about attachment theory and borderline personality disorder. And I can't do that at the minute, and it's so hard to be creative when I can't move. I have to imagine that I am. I have to sit with my head in my hands, and I imagine pacing about the house. I mean, what this highlights is that I clearly need an extension on the back of my house where I can pace about and talk to the wall if I want to. But it also goes to show that we're all different, and that there are no rules, are there? We just have to do what's right for us. And I guess COVID has helped me to understand myself better, and I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in that. Maybe that's one of the very few good things to come out of a pandemic. It's forcing us to confront ourselves more and work out what makes us tick, so that when things do return to how they were, we have some greater insight into ourselves. So, Robin, let's leave it here for today. Thanks again. Thanks so much for coming on to the show. It's been brilliant to have you on board.
No, thanks very much for having me on. I love talking about these things, and I think more and more, the more that we get shows with you doing things like this, it's just better. It's kind of all these different ways of exploring the mind. It's where we live for our whole life, after all, isn't it? So
we have nowhere else to be.
Yeah.
Right. I'll leave you to it, Robin. Thanks again for coming on, and here's to 2021. You take care.
Brilliant. Cheers, Richard.
What a nice guy, and so full of interesting stuff. As always, I'll add some links into the show notes where you can find more info about Robin and where to buy any of his books. I highly recommend his work. He really does have some great ways of putting things across. So, it's the end of 2020, and unless you're a patron, you won't hear back from me until January. But if you are a patron, then obviously I'll be back on Monday as normal. Thank you for your support through 2020. I feel very lucky that you were all there for me, and I hope you enjoyed me being here for you too. Here's to 2021, which might seem a lot like 2020 at first, but it absolutely is going to get better and better. Onwards and upwards, folks. I'll speak to you soon. You take care of yourselves.